my name is Alice Walker. I am currently a PhD student at Oxford Brookes University, which is kind of the poor man's Oxford. That's how they advertise it. It's the Oxford that's not quite as good as Oxford. And I'm fine with that. So I am there, I'm being funded under a studentship, so I'm being paid to carry out research. And kind of the area of research is, as you can see here, housing, health and social care in an ageing population. So that's kind of the overarching research theme. So it's shared research between built environment and nursing, which is quite innovative to kind of try and bring together two separate subjects. So I'm kind of employed to do this work. Within this, I can pick what it is I particularly want to focus on. My research is into housing decisions in later life. And basically, I'm here today to kind of talk a little bit about my research, what I find interesting, and basically to beg a favour, because my research needs people to talk to who are in later life and thinking about housing. So I'm here basically with my bedding bowl to say, please, if you would be so kind as to help me out. And I hope to, in the next kind of 20 minutes, show why I think it's really important that this research goes on. So yeah, so that's me there with my grandmother. I'm the one at the front. My grandmother's the one who looks a little bit like Margaret Thatcher. Yeah, my grandmother's dream for me was that I'd be the next Tony Benn. Sadly, that hasn't in any way, shape or form come to pass. Why am I doing what I'm doing? I think housing is incredibly important. I think it's one of those things that we take for granted and that we don't talk about enough. And I think later life housing in particular, and I'll come on to kind of definitions of what do I mean by later life, what do I mean by housing in a moment. But I think that fundamentally, housing is the cornerstone of a life that's lived well. And we know that good housing leads to better outcomes from very young onwards, and that poor housing in terms of housing that's inaffordable, unsafe, damp, dangerous, insecure, leads to really quite poor housing outcomes. And that's simply a fact. We also know as we get older, as our bodies age and we face more challenges, housing becomes even more important because we have the challenges of, slips and falls, the greater impact that has on our outcomes. So housing's massive. And housing is the kind of thing that we don't often talk about. And people are very reluctant to kind of think about housing. You often go out and people will say things like, no, I'm never going to go into a home. I'm going to leave this place in a box. And you think, great, wonderful. Is that really a plan? Or is that just something that you're saying because thinking about things can be really challenging? Also, selfishly, I'm aging and I live in housing. I want to know how I can make the best housing choices as I age. And I want to be able to help other people to make those choices as well. And this is what I find really odd about housing and aging. Unless we die, we are going to age. That's it. There is no alternative to that. And people still talk about those poor old people, or when I get older, or that'll never happen to me. And you think, well, it will. That's it. Unless you get hit by the number 10 bus, you are going to age and you're going to need to live somewhere. And we know that if you don't engage with this, you can end up in quite a pickle. So that's why I feel that if we can get small things right around helping people make housing choices, it have a massive impact. And I don't think we're talking about big stuff. Also, I really like housing. So who am I to be sitting here talking about housing? My whole career has been around health, housing, and social care in different forms. So I started off back when I was 18, working in dementia care, end-of-life care, nursing homes, which is good when you're 18, I think, to have that experience. You kind of realise really soon that life sometimes is unfair, life sometimes is difficult and that we all age. I then worked for a while in the Scottish Health Department. I worked for many years in brain injury and challenging behaviour hospitals. Again, working with people whose lives have changed in ways they never imagined overnight. I then went into working in mental health and homelessness in London. I worked in Westminster for a while, which is very, very interesting. Before joining City of York Council back in 2009 now. So there I set up York's first housing advice service for older people. We got some kind of government funding, we applied for some government funding to do this, as I really kind of felt passionately that we have housing advice, but we don't have really specific tailored housing advice for older people that relates to York. It doesn't relate to national stuff that's on the ground. And I sort of spent sort of 5 years cycling around York in all kinds of weather, speaking to people in their own homes, in nursing homes, in hospitals, and developing this kind of specialism around people with significant care needs often, lots of people with kind of complex housing needs. And it was great. And I learned such a lot. I then got tired of cycling around York in all weathers and trained somebody else up to do that and became a manager. That wasn't great for me. I'm not a management person, really. So I then joined DEFRA, where I'm now senior government policy advisor for the environment. And they've very generously given me 3 years to go and study. So through my life, I've kind of like had housing and social care and health and aging there. So for me, this is like a great opportunity to bring all those things together, because I do think that academics can sometimes be a bit removed, and they kind of sit and they academicize about housing policy and housing ideas, but they haven't actually sat by somebody's bed after they've had a stroke and had to tell them, you can't go home. And I think having those both sides for me has been invaluable. I think it gives me a really good insight into the reality of life. So why do housing decisions matter? I think they matter enormously, because as I said, it's the cornerstone for a life well lived. And we know that if we can improve housing outcomes, we can improve people's life, we can improve people's lives in the way that they want to live them. And that's what I think is really key, is it's about choice and decision-making and having agency and being able to decide what you want when you want it. So coming on to the compulsory stat slide, as Anne kind of noticed, these are quite shocking statistics in some ways. So we've got an aging population. So we are going to go from 11 million at the moment in England to 13 million in, I think that's 2032. Can't quite see the number, but it's a significant increase in the amount of people who are over 65. But at the same time, we're seeing a decrease in life expectancy, and we're seeing a decrease in the amount of time people live in good health. So yeah, 62 years for men, 69 years for women. So of course, women get the worst of all deals. So that's the amount of time you're likely to live without a significant disability or illness. So that means that quite a lot of people are living a large amount of their latter life with ill health. And we know that ill health is exacerbated by poor housing. At the same time, the way we age is changing. So traditionally, I think government policy and kind of the popular imagination of aging is still that a couple gets married and they have kids. And the kids live with them till they're 18 or 19. And then they go off and buy or rent their own house. The couple then lives together in domestic bliss for the majority of their lives. And at the end of their life, the children step back in and provide very supportive care. And then the couple die happily in their own home. I'm not sure that's ever really been the case, but it's certainly not the case now. Society is shifting. The way we age and live is changing. More people are living by themselves. Families are fragmenting. People are, more than we know, are living without children for a variety of reasons. So, if we're looking at this, so 1.3 million men. Which I always find this statistic frightening. So I imagine a mass of 1.3 men over 65 just living and eating beans out of a tin, and living alone, and that's an increase of 67%. This is a really significant shift. And yet the way we think about aging is still in this 1950s idyllic, housewifey kind of story. And also most of us in the UK live independently. So 95% of people over 65 live in mainstream, or what I call general needs accommodation. So it's not retirement, it's not age exclusive, it's just your bog standard. This is interesting compared to other countries such as Australia, Canada, the US, where they have a much more developed specialist market. By specialist, I mean anything that has additional criteria. So you need to be over 65 to live in it. You need to be over 55 to live in it. They have a much more developed market, and they have much more developed policy and legislation governing the standards of specialist housing. We don't have that. We are catching up. But as a result of that, most of us will live in bog standard bricks and mortar terraced house in York. So what is interesting about the choices we make in later life is, A, there's no one there to guide us. So it's interesting, I think, that the only time in our lives when most of us get kind of standardized advice is when we leave school. And you go to the careers advisor and they get out a big book and they go, okay, and you can be a hairdresser, you can be a podiatrist, you can be a petting zoo owner. And we get advice then, and that's it. We don't get any more advice at any other stage in our life. And we are then left with this bizarre situation whereby when we hit 65 or 70, we're suddenly meant to make housing decisions and choices as if we've got all that information, as if we should know what's out there, how to access it. And government policy is really quite set on this. Government policy talks about choice and decision making, and giving you the opportunity to choose. Well, how? And there's so many different options. If we go back to our couple living in the 1950s, their children leave home. Their children have probably got two different routes. You either go kind of off to university or join the army or have some kind of institutional choice, or you leave home and your choice is, do you rent somewhere? Do you buy somewhere? Do you live in a house, a flat, or a camper van? The choices are pretty straightforward. In later life, you're not so lucky, because in some ways you're very lucky, or the choices are multiplied. So we're talking about, actually, do you want to live in the house you're living at the moment? Do you want to think about adaptations to changing that house? So small adaptations, grab rails, bringing up plug heights, medium adaptations, so putting in stair lifts, 3-floor lifts, massive adaptations, so building extensions and swimming pools. So that's a massive chunk of decisions all by itself. Do you want to think about downsizing? Do you want to think about moving somewhere with less maintenance, less gardening? Do you want to think about intergenerational living, which is very kind of popular at the moment? So living with people of different generations, either formally or informally. Co-housing, we have communities that kind of naturally occur together. We think, oh, we'll all move into one area. Specialist housing, again, that's another 20 different options within that option. So retirement, age exclusive, extra care, hub and spoke, gated communities. Do you want to change location? Do you want to move to the seaside? Do you want to change country? Do you want to move towards your friends, towards your family? Do you want to move away from your friends, away from your family? There's an enormous amount of stuff to think about. And how do you start thinking about this? Because the problem as well with later life housing is that it often comes along with other things. So financial changes, you know, later life divorce, health changes, increasing care needs, bereavement, frailty, an appreciation of your own mortality. This is not an emotionally neutral decision. This is not something that you can go into coldly and calculatedly, because the chances are that there's a reason you're making that decision. So it's an emotionally loaded decision. What's also really interesting about later life housing is that it's really hard to talk about because the language is nonsense. So on here we've got 12 or 15 different terms that is used in later life housing. So you've got extra care, closed care, assisted living, integrated retirement community, age exclusive housing. All those mean the same thing. So I can be sitting with Sue and I can say, hey, Sue, do you want to go into some extra care? And she might say, no, thank you. I'm going to go into an integrated retirement community. And I go, okay. It's the same thing. But we're using different language. There's no standardization of language, which makes it very, very difficult. And it also really matters because when I say X and you see Y in your head, we're never going to be able to communicate. So 1 in 3 people in a recent term study believe that an old people's home means the same thing as retirement housing. And obviously those are 2 completely different ends of the spectrum. So retirement housing is fully independent, and old people's home, which is a phrase that's not even used anymore, would be somebody, you know, a small room potentially in, you know, a facility for providing care. So at the moment, for example, my father-in-law is thinking about moving. They live in a 4-bed house in Maidenhead, massive garden. He's constantly on the roof in leather-soled shoes. It's a nightmare. And I'm trying to get him to think about his options. And I was saying, what about, you know, retirement accommodation? And I knew that as soon as I said that, what he saw in his mind was his mother in a nursing home in Ireland in the 1970s. And nothing that I could do will shake that, because he hears retirement, he sees nursing home, and 1 in 3 people are doing the same. So it's really difficult to have a good discussion, because we're not talking about the same thing. And this is the same, again, I think, as I was mentioning, what is later life? What is an older person? So the the standard definition of an older person is 65. But actually, the rationale for that is when Bismarck was setting up Germany's social security system in the 1800s, he wanted to find an age to offer a state pension by which most people would be dead. So he picked 65 because in the 1800s, not many people reached that age. So he could safely put in a pension and say, oh, I've given you, I'm not going to do a German accent, then I'm not going to. I've given you a pension. So 65 is an arbitrary number that we've now latched onto for the last 200 odd years. And it's still used today. But is it actually that useful? So I think in many ways, when we're talking about older, later life housing, people who are under 65 go, oh, but I'm not 65 yet. People who are over 65 go, but I'm not that kind of 65. Mm. And it's this idea of, it's always over the hill. Again, my father-in-law, who's 82, will talk about the poor old people. I'm like, how old are they, Brian? Because you're 85. But it's always, it's pushing it away, pushing it away. We don't have to look at it. We don't want to think about it. So it's really interesting that housing is really complicated, and we make it more complicated by not using the correct language, by not talking about things, by not discussing it, and by having no real understanding of what we're talking about. So I always talk about the later life housing equation. I don't. My mum is a maths person, and if I showed her that, she'll be so ashamed of me, because she'll be like, "What does it mean, Alice?" And I'm like, "I don't know. I just picked it off the internet because it looks complicated. But I think what we're doing when we're talking about later life housing is we're doing a lot of things at the same time. I think the government likes to think that we get 65 and we make a decision around housing. Boom, easy. But we're not. What we're doing is we're trying to solve so many different problems at the same time with so little information and so much fear and so much not wanting to think about the future, that we end up with this enormous sprawling thing, which is easier. I mean, I would rather not solve that equation. I would rather put the telly on and watch Bargain Hunt. I don't want to because it's too much. So what I'm trying to do is try to work out, actually, in reality, when people think about housing, what are they doing? What's going on? So they're thinking about a bungalow, a flat, retirement, and what's going on in the back office? What is it that makes some people make really good choices and some people not? And there's also the assumption that you're going to get 65 and become a good decision maker. And there's no reason to think that. If you were a rubbish decision maker when you were 18 and 20 and 30 and 40, you're not going to suddenly become incredibly pragmatic and sensible and logical. Because, I mean, unless a miracle takes place, which I'm praying for, I don't think that happens. So what I'm doing so far is I'm looking at the literature around making decisions when you're over 65. And I picked 65 because everyone else has, so I'm not going to rock the boat. And what I've discovered so far is that I think there are 5 bits of the equation. So there's yourself, how you relate to yourself, how you think about your own personality, how do you see yourself as a resilient person? Are you somebody who's proactive? Are you self-doubting? So that's kind of at the center. Then we have places, and that's kind of both practical stuff, like where do you live? What's the great stuff? What's the not so good stuff? But also, how do you relate to that space? Because, again, housing's not just bricks and mortar, is it? It's where memories are made. It's where, you have all these experiences. Then there's the doings, the practical stuff. So, planning, researching, cars, dogs. Yeah, the kind of the stuff that we do. Then we have the 2 really interesting bits, which I really want to focus on. The first bit is time, because I don't think we ever make a decision that's just, if I made a decision today, it's not just based on the 11th of January 2023. That is informed by everything that I've ever experienced. Growing up, my family, my grandparents, their experience. And it's also really connected to what I think about the future and how I imagine my future and my fears of the future, and whether I can kind of look at that and work with it, or whether the future is so overpowering for me that I don't think about it. And then there's people, and these are the other people who factor into the way we make decisions. So there's kind of like spouses. Obviously, that's generally important. If someone has a spouse or a partner, they're going to impact on decision making. But also the proxy, by which I mean kind of the experiences of other people. I think this is a really powerful thing that impacts on our decision making. Is, like I said, for my father-in-law, it's his mum's experience. And she went into a nursing home, I say, in Ireland in the 1970s. It was a very, very upsetting experience for him. So every decision he makes about housing, whether it's conscious or unconscious, has this ghost behind it, has this shadow. And until we understand that, and time, and self, we can't really understand how we make decisions, and we can't really work out how to help people make decisions. So if you think about making a decision, what do we need to do? What do we need to make any kind of decision? So we need the information. And I think in housing decisions, that's stuff like what's available, how much does it cost, where is it? But it's also information such as, how will it make me feel? How will I feel if I don't do this? How will I feel if I decide not to move and I have a fall and I can't get to the upstairs of my house? So the information is not just factual, it's emotional. How will my sister feel if I move away from her? How will I feel if I can't have a dog? So I think we focus on the practical information, and even the practical information is not easy to get. If you want to make a decision around housing, who do you speak to? Who do you ask? Where do you go? It's not clear, and let alone the emotional stuff. But you feel to understand the information, and I think a lot of this, and the next bit about weighing and balancing, when as human beings we do that, we don't do it in a vacuum. We tend to find value in talking, in discussing, in working through things emotionally with other people often, to actually really understand it and to really work out how does it make me feel, how does it affect me? And then we need to feel to use that information to arrive at a decision. And again, that's two separate things. There's a decision that you can do practically in terms of finances, having the options, having the housing stock available. And then there's the making a decision that you can actually make yourself. So it's all well and good saying, I want to move to, you should move to a house, you should move to a flat. But if you're emotionally not able to do that for whatever reason, that decision can't be made in the same way that you can't make a decision if you can't afford it. And until we kind of understand how those bits gel together, we're never going to help people make decisions. So what do we know about housing decisions in later life? We know that if we just give someone some information, so if I give Sue a brochure about flats in New Earswick and then walk away, the chances of Sue making a decision are very low because it doesn't mean anything. It's a two-dimensional thing. What makes information work is establishing social relationships, using dialogue, and having that kind of doing the emotional work around it. Being able to express our fears, being able to express our worries, our aspirations. We do know that if you gather information, if you have agency, so you're able to make your own choices, and you can choose proactively when you want to, the outcomes are better. If you flip that and you have a decision made that you don't really want to, you feel pushed into it, you don't really understand it, you haven't got the information, and you feel railroaded, the chances are you're going to feel less happy with that decision. So the next step of that would seem to be that people who don't defer the process are able to make the best decisions. And that's true even if the decision is to not make a decision. If Linda decides she wants to think about housing, and we sit down and we go through all the different options, and at the end of it she says, actually no, I'm quite happy, I don't want to do anything. But she's done the emotional work, she's been through that process of thinking. If then, touch wood, never happens, something catastrophic happens, and the choice is taken out of her hands, she'll still feel better because she's been through that emotional work. She's decided not to decide. The worst thing you can do is to not think about stuff and to not decide anything. Couples, interestingly, being a couple can be great. It can give you mutual support. The downside is that couples can often push things too far because they kind of live together, they support each other, one's health goes up, one goes down, and they kind of like balance it out. But that means that sometimes they can defer the decision until it's too late. And they end up in a crisis whereby both of them have a fall at the same time. The other person isn't able to pick up the slack anymore. So that couples are sometimes able to kind of hide the situation through mutual support. And also there's sometimes interesting things where couples refuse to speak to each other. They're both playing head in the sand. So that's an interesting one. We also know that moving, so if you are going to move, if you move to somewhere that has meaning, so that can be somewhere that you know, somewhere that you like, somewhere that has spiritual meaning for you or emotional meaning, moving towards friends or family, and moving while you're in good health or in, better health than you may be in the future, gives you a good outcome. So this is all about just making a choice to make a choice. Even if that choice is to do nothing, but thinking and starting to work through and do that emotional work. And we know that people have less plans in place for housing than pretty much anything else. If you ask most people, have you got a will? They'll go, yep, sorted. Have you got a funeral plan? Yep. With lasting power of attorney, we're seeing people really engaging with that, about advanced health directives. If you say to the same person, what's your housing plan? They will most often say, either I'm never going to go into a home, or I'll leave here in a box. And again, it's like, well, that's great, but what about the bit in between? And how are you going to do that? And people will say things like, my father-in-law, going back to him, because he's irritating at the moment, I asked him, how are you going to make a decision? What are you going to do? And he said, God will sort me out. And I said, but Brian, God is not an estate agent that I know of. I don't believe God has diversified into that particular side of things, but he's adamant that God will sort him out. So you hear that, you hear the council will sort me out. They, having worked for the council, I can pretty much guarantee they will not. There's a real passivity. And I think it's because if you want to make a will, you go to a solicitor. If you want to make a funeral plan, you go down the co-op. If you want to make a housing plan, what do? You have a quick Google around, you feel very overwhelmed, and you think, I'll do it tomorrow. So what do I want to do? I want to understand the ways in which people really make housing choices, and to try and understand this bit in the middle, this emotional stuff, how our past and everything that we kind of go through in our life, how that affects us. Who do we listen to? When we're talking about kind of the proxy and the other people, which stories are we hearing? I think sometimes we tend to concentrate on very negative stories. I think there's a shift now. I think there's sometimes, like the Richard Osman books have been a real plus for people be talking about retirement accommodation in a very positive way. But who is it? So what's going on below the surface when we make housing decisions? Because we're not just making them in a vacuum. Who do we listen to? What information do we need? So for me, it's like, what are the ghosts in the equation? We've got really practical stuff in the equation, like using Rightmove to find out what's available in York, which would work anyway for retirement accommodation, or how much equity do I have in my property? But underneath that, there's all this other stuff that's going on. That's about our personalities, about the way we make decisions, about the way we think about other people. And that's what I want to understand. So what do I want? In return for my obviously fascinating talk here, I want to carry out interviews with people over 65 who live in North Yorkshire and who rent or own their own home. I want to talk to them about how they make decisions, how they understand decisions, what their kind of housing history has been. So yeah, that's what I'm here today to, so that Dragon's Den, isn't it? To ask you if you'd be willing to participate. It'll be up to an hour chatting with me, very informally, either face-to-face, on the phone, on Zoom, wherever, whatever you want to do, talking about your experience of housing, what drives your decision-making, what you pay attention to, so the story of your housing life. Obviously, it wouldn't be too boring. Some people find it quite interesting. Obviously, anything that you don't want to talk about is absolutely fine. And then that will be then analysed, become part of my PhD, form papers and conferences and nonsense. But for me, as somebody who's worked in housing my whole life, I want to do something that actually will make a difference. I don't think there's any point in doing a PhD where you find out that Jane Austen had one left leg shorter than the other. I think if you can do something that makes a real difference, even in a small way, if you can, help some people make better housing choices, then that's going to be a pretty good thing to have a go at, and that's what I hope to do. So yes, that's me done. Thank you very much.